Hi, thanks for joining me today. I'm John Azera with Fastmere, and we're going to talk about understanding your 360 report. So this is the agenda we'll go through. I'm going to review each section of the report and how to analyze it and what to look for. And I'm also going to talk about Johari Window, which is a tool that can help individuals understand their perception of themselves relative to the perception other people have of them. And then we'll talk about how that relates to the blind spots and hidden strengths section of the report. So the first section of the report that we'll talk about is the About This Report section. And really what this section provides is it gives you a background on what the report is about. It might give you some additional information on the particular program you might be involved in. If you're involved in a leadership cohort program or a individual 360 program, whatever your 360 admin team at your company may have set up, this section of the report might give you more detail. What you want to look for in this section is any specific information or directions or instructions or just actions that you might need to take once you get your report. And that section looks like this right here. In the case of our example, it's pretty generic, but like I said, you might have more information there. The other thing I want to make you aware of is I'm going to be going through every single section that's available in a Fastmere individual report. Depending on how your 360 administration team set up your individual report, you may not have every section in your report that I cover. And in those cases, you can skip over them if you want. So the next section we have is the People Asked section. In this section, we provide the names and the relationships of the individuals who were invited to provide feedback or who were invited to participate in the feedback process. It does not provide information on who did or did not respond. It simply serves as a reminder as to who was asked to participate. So it looks like this. You can see the names of everybody asked to participate and the relationship, how they were identified in terms of their relationship, boss, direct report, colleague, peer, things like that. The next section we have is the response rate section, and this provides aggregated information on how each relationship group responded. And so what you want to look for here is how well each group that was selected to participate is represented in the final tally of people that answered the questions. And notice if there were certain groups that didn't respond or maybe certain groups that were excluded. So that section of the report looks like this here. In this case, we have the boss, direct reports, colleagues and peers, and clients were asked to respond. We can see how many individuals from each of these groups was asked and then how many actually did respond and then the total response rate. Next section we'll talk about is the rating scale section. And the rating scale section really just indicates the rating/response scale that was used in the survey. An important note here is if your 360 administration team used what's called behaviorally anchored rating scales, then the response scale will not be uniform. It will not be the same scale that was used for every question. It will actually be a different scale that was used for every question. And if that's the case, I'll talk about where you can find that particular rating scale, and we'll get into more detail on that in a little bit. Next, we have the Competency Summary section, and this section provides the overall aggregated mean rating or average for each competency, and it's rank ordered, which means the highest competency is at the top and the lowest one is at the bottom. So what you want to look for in this section is what are the highest and what are the lowest competencies. The other thing you want to think about is how critical are these competencies to the individual's either current role, or in the case of you're interpreting your own report, how important or critical these competencies are to your current role, or how critical they are to future roles that maybe you aspire to. So that section looks like this. You have the rank ordering of the competencies, with the highest scoring competency at the top, the lowest scoring competency at the bottom. And over here to the right, we have 4 additional pieces of data. You have the average, which is reported both on the bar in this column here. You have the highest rating that was given for each competency and the lowest rating that was given. And then you have what's called N, and that represents the sample size or the total number of individuals that actually answered the questions or provided feedback, in this case, on each of the competencies. Next, we'll talk about the Competency Breakout section. And the Competency Breakout section provides the overall aggregated mean rating or average for each relationship category by competency. So it's a little different in that it's actually going to give you more detail, and it's going to break out how each of those relationship groups that were invited to participate, how each of those groups responded to every single competency. So what you want to look for here are any noticeable group differences. And an example of this that you might come across is what we call managing up, kicking down. And this is where a manager rates an individual higher than the direct reports do. This could be indicative of what we call impression management, where an individual is behaving differently with their boss or supervisor than they do with their direct reports. So they're managing that impression, or they manage upward, as we call it. The other thing you want to be aware of is any trends across relationship categories. An example of this might be, do you notice that peers are rating the individual lower across all the competencies relative to the other groups? Or are the clients doing that? Or are direct reports doing that? So those are just things that you want to be aware of when you're looking at the competency breakout section. And this is what the section looks like. And you have all the competencies broken out, except you have now additional detail on all the groups that participated and how they responded, and with the aggregated mean and average. Things that would be interesting might be the similarity around how all the groups rate changing and adapting. And then maybe we get into down here, you can see there's some variation in how the groups are rating on influence and keeping people motivated. So those are the type of things you want to be aware of. So the next section we'll talk about is the question breakout section. And this section breaks out each question by competency and the aggregated mean or average rating for each relationship category. So what you want to look for here, similar to the competency breakout section, you want to look for any noticeable group differences. Do you see managing up, kicking down, that impression management I talked about earlier? Do you notice any trends across relationship categories? Peers rating individuals lower across all the questions relative to the other groups. This is where you want to start to think about actions and behaviors. The question and breakout section is usually going to be the heart of the 360 report, because this is where you're going to start to see the observable behaviors, where you're going to start to get more granular detail on how people were rated on individual behaviors and what those rating scales mean. If your 360 survey is using the behaviorally anchored rating scale system, you want to pay attention to those. They're going to help you get a real good understanding of the behavior that is occurring for each of these questions. And once again, you always want to be thinking in terms of how critical these questions are to either the current role or future roles. And here's what the question breakout section looks like, and we'll take a look at an example of a behaviorally anchored rating scale. So if we look at these two questions here, sets clear performance expectations, we can see that used a standard strongly disagree to agree 5-point scale. But if we look at this question here, when dealing with mistakes made by staff, we can see that this is a behaviorally anchored rating scale. What that means is that all of the points 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, they all have different behavioral anchors. So this helps to calibrate raters around the types of behaviors that they may see, and it helps them categorize their experience with an individual in a much more accurate way than they might be able to with a standard strongly disagree to strongly agree scale. If your 360 is using a behaviorally anchored rating scale, you're going to want to refer to the section down here for each question to give you an indicator of what these particular scores mean. And once again, as I said, this is going to give you some strong insight into potential activities or actions that you can utilize to help somebody develop, or in cases of strength, actions or activities that people can take to continue to leverage areas where they're really strong. So the next section we'll talk about is the highest rated question section. And this section provides an aggregated mean across all the groups for the highest rated questions. So what do you want to look for here? Well, first you want to be aware the highest rated questions are going to be subject, or they're going to be relative to the rating scale used. FastMirror is just telling you here are the highest rated questions. You could have a 5-point scale where the highest rated question was a 2.5 or a 2. That's actually not a very high rating relative to the scale. So you have to be aware of how many points were used in the scale, and then proceed accordingly. So what do you want to look for here? What are the areas of strength the individual should continue to leverage? And here's what that section looks like. You may have more or less questions. You may have 5, you may have 2, you may have 1 question. It depends on how your 360 team decided to set up the highest rated questions portion. It'll give you the rank order, in this case, of the top 5 highest rated questions, the competency section that they belong to, the specific question, or the sample size, or the number of people that actually answered the question, and then, of course, the average or the mean. Next, we have the lowest rated question section. This provides an aggregated mean across all groups for the lowest rated questions. You want to be aware the score is going to be relative to the scale. You could have somebody whose lowest rated question is a 4.5 or a 4 on a 5-point scale. That's obviously a relatively high rating. In this section, you want to be paying attention to areas of development that should be considered. And this is what the lowest rated question section looks like. It's very similar to the highest rated question section, except it's just showing you either the top 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 lowest rated questions. So the next section we'll talk about is the comment section. This section breaks out the open-ended comment text by relationship category for all of the open-ended questions that were asked. So what do you want to look for in this section? You want to look for trends. Comments that are repetitive. Do you see key phrases being reused? Or are you seeing the comments are more scattered, they're more diffuse? The other thing you want to look for is, do any of these comments start to support the quantitative data that you've gone through already? And this is what the comment section of the report looks like. You'll have each question that was asked, and it will be broken out by a relationship group that responded to that question. So the next section we'll look at is the competencies change over time section. And this breaks out how aggregated ratings by competency have changed over time. If this is your first 360, you're probably not going to have this section. This section is typically used if you are involved in a program where you do a pre and a post 360. So you do a pre 360, get the feedback, maybe you go through a program, a leadership development program or a supervisory development program, and then at the end of that, you would do a post assessment to assess any change in the competencies and the questions from the initial assessments. And so what you want to look for is really positive or negative changes over time. So if you see positive changes, what that indicates is that whatever you're doing from a development standpoint, it's working, and that you want to keep doing that because it is facilitating change. On the converse, if you see a regression or you see that you're going backwards and you're not scoring as highly as you initially did, then you need to course correct. You need to change your development tactics and you need to try something else. So this is what that section looks like, the competencies change over time section. You can see in this case for changing and adapting, where the individual's going backwards a little bit. They were a 4, now they're a 2.95, so they should probably change whatever they're doing here. On the remaining 4 competencies, they're improving. So they should continue to improve and do whatever it is that they're doing there. So the next section we're going to talk about is questions change over time. Very similar to the previous section we just discussed. The only difference is this breaks out how the aggregated ratings by question have changed over time. So once again, what do you want to look for? Positive or negative changes. Positive changes are indicating that things are working. Negative changes are indicating that maybe you need to course correct and try something new. And so once again, here is what the questions change over time looks like. That section looks like, in this case, changing and adapting. We can see that the person is going backwards a little bit. And all of the other sections, they're showing improvement for each of the questions. The next section we'll talk about is blind spots and hidden strengths section. Hidden strengths are when self-ratings are lower than all other ratings, and blind spots are when self-ratings are higher than all other ratings. Before I get into that section, before I talk about it, I want to talk about Johari Window and what this is and how to utilize this. So Johari Window is a tool that individuals can use to help them understand how they perceive themselves relative to how others around them perceive them. So it's based on 4 quadrants. We have the open, the blind, the unknown, and the hidden quadrant. The open quadrant is things that you know about yourself and that others know about you. The blind quadrant are things that others know or perceive about you, but that you may not be aware of, or the individual may not be aware of. The unknown section are things that neither you nor others know about you. And the hidden section are things that you keep private. They're things that you know about yourself, but others don't. And so if we look at the X and the Y axis, it's based on things that are known to others and not known to others along the Y axis, and then known to self and not known to self along the X axis. 360 provides a unique opportunity to examine the top two quadrants, the open and the blind section. So the open section is really analogous to areas where the self-assessment and the ratings of all others are congruent. There's not a lot of difference between those scores. And that could be either high or low. Perhaps the self-score, the individual knows they're not super effective at a particular behavior, and all others agree the individual's not effective at that behavior. So there's some congruence there. And then conversely, on the high end, there's agreement between the self score and all other scores that there's a strength there. And then we get into the blind section. And the blind section is where there's a lack of congruence. There's not alignment. And typically this is going to be the self score is wildly different than all other scores, either positive or negative. And in cases where the self-score is higher than all other scores, we call that a blind spot. The individual perceives themselves as being more effective than everybody else does. And then on the other hand, the self-score is lower than all other scores. We call that a hidden strength. That is the uniqueness of 360 and what you're able to do with it. That is the heart of what the blind spots and hidden strengths section is about. The way that the blind spots and hidden strengths section work is that your 360 administrators can choose to set the gap score. And when I say the gap score, I'm referring to the differences between the self score here in blue and the all rater score here in orange. The gap score may be set to 1, 2, 3. It really depends on the length of the rating scale. For example purposes, the gap score is set to 1. So show me all of the questions where the differences between the self and all of the other raters is greater than 1, running in either direction, either positive or negative. So in cases of hidden strength, we can see that the self score, the individual rated him or herself a 2, but everybody else, the combined aggregated score of all the other raters is a 4. So that's a 2-point difference. So this may be indicating a hidden strength where the individual actually doesn't necessarily perceive themselves particularly adept at addressing resistance to change, but everybody else does. And this is important because people need to understand that this is a strength that they actually have that they leverage more. So they may be not engaging in this behavior purposefully because they think they're not very good at it, when in fact they may be very good at it. So it's important to understand those hidden strengths. Conversely, we have the blind spots. The self score is going to be higher than all other scores. In this case, we have 2 point higher. It's 2 points higher here. It's 1.4 points higher here. And you can see the differences reflected over here. And these are negative, meaning that the self-score, the individual perceives themselves more effective than everybody else does. This is where we start to get into what we call derailers. This is where people can assume they have skill sets that they don't actually have and engage in behavior that they think they're good at when in fact they're not, and it could damage their career, could damage the perception in the organization. So this is really critical information to be aware of as well. But it's also important to help identify areas where development can occur and where the person needs to develop. The next section we'll talk about is the question rating frequency section. And this section breaks out the frequency each rating scale response option was selected by question. So what do you want to look for in this section? In this section, you really want to examine whether the frequencies are clustered or dispersed. Clustered ratings may indicate stronger agreement regarding how an individual is perceived, whereas dispersed ratings may indicate a lack of agreement or the person is behaving differently depending on the group that they're interacting with. So this gets back to that impression management I talked about earlier. You need to be aware of whether these are clustered or dispersed. And so this is what that particular section looks like. So we look at the first one, addressing resistance to change. We can see that the response options are pretty well clustered around 4. Which indicates, well, that the person is strong, there's some strong agreement. That's an example of a clustered frequency response. When we get into some of the other questions, we can start to see they're a little bit more dispersed, right? Influencing others toward a desired course of action. And you want to understand any differences here, right? So we've got, in this case, we've got the boss or the direct managers clustering around 4, but then we've got others, peers, and a skip level boss that's clustering around 2s. There's something going on there potentially. There's a lack of agreement, which may indicate either, one, it could just be lack of experience with the particular groups with the individual. They just don't have enough experience to rate the person. But more likely it's going to be some level of impression management where individuals may be behaving differently depending on the groups. Okay, so that covers all of the report sections in the FASTMIR individual report. So here's some overall tips for interpreting your report, or if you're a debriefer, interpreting the report of somebody you're going to be giving feedback to. First is assuming positive intent. You may come across information that you're not happy with or that you have an emotional reaction to. But the key component of this is assuming positive intent, that nobody who's providing feedback for you is out to hurt your feelings or try to quote unquote get you. They're trying to be helpful. They're trying to answer the questions and provide the information the best they can from the perspective and the experience that they have with you. So they're trying to be helpful. Always at least assume that. Understand that there's going to be differences between your perception and those of others. So we call this the illusion of transparency. And so the illusion of transparency is this concept that a lot of times we think other people see us the same way that we see ourselves. That disconnect is what we call the illusion of transparency. It's very common, but you just need to be aware that does occur, and there's going to be differences between how you see yourself and how others see you, and it's going to run both ways. It's going to run positive and it's going to run negative. Don't get overwhelmed by all of the data. Focus on the trends, focus on the high-level stuff, focus on the trends. And when you get into the development needs and development planning portion, when you start to think about, okay, what do I want to work on? What do I want to fix? What do I want to address? We've seen from our research that you really want to pick just one thing to focus on. And the reason is there's so many other things that are going on in the natural course of a work day and work life that focusing on any more than one thing is going to be very overwhelming. It increases the probability that you won't really focus on any of it and you'll just forget about it and not really address anything that you need to address. Also, think about your report as a living document. This is something where you can always come back to it, right? So you take your report, you say, I want to focus on this one thing. If you find that you're making really, really good progress in a few months from now, then go back and pick another thing to focus on. The last thing you want to think about when you're interpreting your report or looking at your report is really 360 feedback is about creating awareness of how you're perceived. You don't need to change the core of who you are or your personality. That's not what we're talking about with 360. What we're talking about is behavioral change, right? Being aware of your behavioral tendencies as reported by other people that you work with, and you want to focus on those shifts that you can make in your behavior and not major shifts in your personality. The majority of the value of the 360 is just the awareness around the perception. And so once you're aware, you can actually take that and make some decisions about how you want to change that, or even if you want to. So last, I want to talk about your reaction toward your report information. You may have an emotional reaction to the data. So here's how I would tell you to address some of the emotional reaction that you might have to your report. Take some time to internalize the information. So read through your report. Remember, keep positive intent in mind. Nobody's out to get you. They're trying to give you information on their perceptions and their work experience with you. So internalize that information. Discuss it with somebody that you trust. Trusted advisor, work colleague, friend, family member. And then keep in mind, you might need to go through this data a couple times. But also always realize you're in control. You can do whatever you want with this data. You can choose to do something with the data or not. But you also need to realize the potential consequences of not acting on your data. Realize you don't need to change who you are. You just need to change some behavioral tendencies. Okay, so that concludes the video. I hope you found it helpful. If you have questions, and if you are using the FASTMIR 360 product platform, what I would suggest is that you reach out first to your 360 administration team on any questions regarding a report interpretation or any specific direction that your team or company may want you to take with your data, you can always reach out to the Fastmirror team at help@fast-mirror.com. Don't forget the dash in between fast and mirror. And you can always go to our site at fastmirror.com and you can reach out to us there as well. Okay, thanks for your time. Bye.